In a development that unfolded like a high-stakes courtroom revelation, Mark Carney stood at the center of a decision that blindsided Washington entirely. No department, no agency, no analyst foresaw what was about to emerge. 4. Without warning, Canada and Mexico unveiled a sweeping bilateral trade and economic corridor, an agreement that, by its very design, excluded the United States from the structure of North American trade. For 18 months, both nations had endured mounting pressure. Tariffs, threats, and ultimatums had been applied from Washington, with the expectation that economic gravity would force compliance. Instead, under that pressure, something else took shape. Quietly, deliberately, and beyond the reach of American oversight, behind closed doors, over the course of 4 months, a small group of senior officials from both countries met in secrecy. There were no leaks, no drafts circulating through think tanks, no digital traces to intercept. Every discussion took place face-to-face in neutral locations, with a level of operational discipline more akin to intelligence work than trade negotiations. And it worked. By the time Washington became aware, the agreement was already signed, the rollout already scheduled, and implementation already in motion. When the announcement finally broke, the response from the White House was not measured. It was immediate, and it was personal. The president appeared before cameras in a hastily arranged press conference that would last 19 minutes. What unfolded in that room would become a defining moment, not because of policy, but because of reaction. There were no prepared remarks, no teleprompter, no visible structure. Instead, there was visible frustration, not the calculated performance of political theater, but something more raw, an unmistakable sense of being caught off guard. He dismissed the agreement outright, labeling it insignificant, unsustainable, and destined to fail. He insisted it lacked the economic weight to survive without American involvement. He claimed companies would ignore it out of loyalty. But each of those assertions was quickly measured against the facts, and each one fell apart under scrutiny because the agreement itself was anything but fragile. At its core was a tariff-free corridor. Goods would move between Canada and Mexico without duties, without quotas, and without the friction that typically slows cross-border trade. Resources from the north, energy, minerals, agricultural output, would flow south. Manufactured goods, electronics, and consumer products would move north. Together, they formed a unified market of tens of millions, backed by trillions in combined economic output. Then came the manufacturing zones, shared production spaces where Canadian resources met Mexican industrial capacity. These zones were designed to produce goods more efficiently than those constrained by American tariff structures. Lower costs, broader access to global markets, and no tariff burden created a competitive advantage that American manufacturers could not easily match. Another pillar of the agreement focused on critical minerals. Resources identified as strategically vital were now being processed through a joint system supported by international investment. This created a supply chain that operated entirely outside American regulatory influence. Investment flowed in both directions. Canadian capital supported infrastructure and production in Mexico, while Mexican investment entered Canadian sectors like housing and technology. The result was a system that sustained itself, not through political alignment, but through financial return. Once established, it became difficult to undo because dismantling it would mean disrupting profitable, deeply embedded economic ties. But the most consequential provision was something else entirely. A clause allowing third-party access. Under this mechanism, goods from other global economies, Europe, Asia, and beyond, could enter North America through Canada or Mexico, be processed under corridor rules, and distributed without encountering American tariffs. It didn't violate trade law. It didn't break any agreements. It simply offered an alternative path, and that path changed everything, because from that point forward, every tariff imposed by the United States didn't just restrict trade, it redirected it. Higher tariffs made the corridor more attractive. The barrier didn't stop movement, it shifted it elsewhere. The more aggressively tariffs were used, the more valuable the alternative became. Even more critically, the structure created a cost imbalance. American manufacturers, operating behind their own tariff system, faced higher input costs. Meanwhile, production within the corridor benefited from tariff-free access to resources and labor. The result was a widening gap, one that made goods produced outside the United States more competitive on the global stage. What had once been a system centered on American influence had been reconfigured. Years earlier, the United States had championed continental trade integration, building a framework where it stood at the center. Supply chains, markets, and decisions all revolved around access to American consumers. That system had defined North American commerce for decades, but it had been dismantled, and in its place, something new had emerged, built not by Washington, but by the very nations it had attempted to pressure. The reaction to this shift wasn't limited to the United States. Across the globe, governments and industries took notice. Analysts began evaluating the corridor as a viable alternative route into North American markets. Early assessments showed clear economic advantages, lower costs, fewer barriers, and immediate scalability. Companies didn't wait for political direction, they responded to incentives. Within weeks, major firms began reviewing their supply chains. Some initiated studies on rerouting goods through the corridor. Early projections indicated measurable cost savings, enough to justify structural changes. This wasn't about loyalty. It was about economics, and economics follows its own rules. Attempts to compel businesses to prioritize national strategy over financial return have always faced the same limitation. Companies operate on profitability. When a more efficient path exists, it gets used. Not out of preference, but out of necessity. The corridor provided that path. Meanwhile, the domestic impact began to surface. Agricultural producers, already affected by tariffs, now faced additional competition from goods moving through the new system. Manufacturers encountered a reality where protectionist measures were increasing their own costs while strengthening external competition. Concerns spread through industries that had once supported the original strategy. Requests for reassessment began to emerge. Questions replaced certainty, and through it all, the corridor continued to function, independent of rhetoric, independent of reaction, because its foundation wasn't political. It was structural. Contracts had been signed. Investments had been made. Infrastructure was being built. The system didn't rely on approval or opposition. It operated on its own momentum. What had begun as a strategic maneuver had become something larger, a reconfiguration of how trade could move across a continent. And the moment that revealed it all wasn't the signing of the agreement, it was the reaction that followed. 19 minutes that showed, not control, but the absence of preparation. Not strategy, but surprise. Not dominance, but the recognition that something significant had occurred without warning. In that moment, the narrative shifted, because in competitive systems, whether in markets or geopolitics, there is a principle that repeats itself. When pressure is applied in multiple directions at once, those under pressure begin to align, not out of preference, but out of necessity. And once that alignment forms, it creates something new, something capable of reshaping the balance that produced it. That is what happened here. Two nations, facing the same force, found a solution together. Not because they had planned to, but because the conditions made it inevitable. And what they built, in silence and with precision, now stands as a fully operational framework. One that doesn't confront directly, but instead moves around, adapting, expanding, and strengthening with every attempt to contain it. The realization, when it came, was unmistakable. This was no longer about a single agreement. It was about a system that had learned how to function without the center it once depended on.